The Center for Educational Media and the College of Education at Middle Tennessee State University are proud to offer professional development to K-12 educators in Tennessee through our online video library. These videos are aligned with standards set by the Tennessee Department of Education. For more professional development videos, check out our website at cem.mtsu.edu.
Nancy Motley, I participate in something called ELL Chat Book Club, which is on Twitter. And we read a book called Talk, Read, Talk, Write about a year ago, several months ago. And it is a protocol to help you engage your students. If you went to Christina Danko's session on talk, she talked about a way to, how important it was to get students to talk. Well, one way to give them to talk is always to talk about literature. So, but sometimes we tend to have people talk after they read. But in this protocol, ideally, you all should have come in and talked first. Okay? Talk about what you read. Talk about how you feel about reading. Talk about those things. I skipped over this, but this slide is in that PowerPoint that I shared with you all. And you can use this as a great way to start your class. All right? So to get them to talk first. Now, how many of you all are middle school teachers? How many of you all are high school teachers? How many of you all are terrified of not having those children come in and sit down quietly and do a quiet activity when they walk in? Because if you let them talk when they first come in, it's a little daunting. Okay? We have to get over that because our goal is for our students to talk. And most of us have small classes. Anybody in here have a class larger than 15? 15. How large is your largest class? 25. In an ESL class? No, standard ed? Yeah, okay. All right, standard education is a little different, but yeah. Okay, so this is just a protocol I'm sharing with you. It's also to get you an opportunity. So would someone like to volunteer to share why they read personally? She said enjoyment. Does someone have something else? Yes, ma'am. An escape route. Yes. Anyone else? Yes, ma'am.
To gain new knowledge.
To gain new knowledge. Yes, ma'am. To understand something. Okay. How many of you read to gain new knowledge, to understand something on your own because you want to do it? Okay. How many of you read, how many of you read on your own to gain new knowledge because somebody assigned it to you because you're doing something that you're principal for a class or something like that? Okay, so what we're going to talk about today is hopefully engaging students in fiction reading so that they can in turn gain reading skills, so they can in turn read for understanding, which is, we know, a purpose that goes on for life. So we're going to examine how we can guide older English learners to greater proficiency using the framework. I'm going to talk about the same thing Joseph talked about, the TESOL's 6 principles, and different sources of literature so students can voice their own reading choices, because we need to make sure that they can have a voice in what they're reading. So sometimes the canon, as we call it, is not always appropriate for what our needs are. And then hopefully we can orally discuss best practices to improve proficiency levels, and we can in turn list some books that students might want to read independently or in small group, or even that you might want to read as an ESL teacher in your class. Okay? And the book lists I have are geared toward middle school and high school. These are the 6 practices that he just talked about. He didn't really talk about the last one, which is what you're doing right now. And that one doesn't necessarily go along with getting students a voice and choice, but when we do the last one, we often gain knowledge so that we can help them have a better choice. So the last one is engage and collaborate with a community of practice. How many of you guys have met somebody new here today? How many of you stayed in your little frame of reference and only those people you knew, right? Yeah. Sometimes it's hard. So the first one is know your learner. And he went through this from a Williamson County Schools perspective, and mine is much more general. How does knowing your learner apply to student choice in literature? You know what they like, you know what they're interested in, okay? So what are the things that we need to know about our learners? TESOL tells us we need to have both personal and data. We need to know where they can read, but we need to know what they would want to read. I know I'm speaking to the choir, and I kind of wrote this presentation for grade level teachers, but we know our children's stories, right? And we need to know our children's stories. We need to know our children's family stories. Saddest thing I ever heard, and I don't know how many of you all know your own immigration stories, but many of us are several generations removed from that. But a child whose parents were the immigrants, and I say, well, we're going to write about some things, and what's your parents' immigration story? And they said, I don't know, I don't ever really talk to my parents. You know, now granted, this is middle school. We know how middle schoolers are, right? But that then becomes an assignment. Go home and talk to your parents. Well, they work second shifts, and I'll never see them. I said, you got to see them at some point in time because I know they give you money, right? So when next time you ask them for money, ask them about their immigration story. So we need to know all these things. What are their life experiences? What are their interests? The last one on this list is very important for our children of poverty. What is their access to resources? I just recently read a book that is not even part of this presentation, but if you are teaching many children of poverty, I highly recommend The Benefits of Being an Octopus. And if you have a faculty that is almost all white middle class, and you're in a position where you have mostly poverty students, you should really do this as a faculty study. This is an amazing book. Basically, it's not an immigrant storybook, but it's a story of poverty. And this young girl is the other adult in her home. So who goes home and stays with the kids while her moms work? She does. Okay? Does she do her homework? Not often. How often does she have time to do her homework? Almost never. Great book to open your eyes if you have a lot of middle class white people like myself in your... So anyway, but that's one of the things, if you know who your learners are, and your learners can be the other adults in your building, then you can recommend different literature for them to choose from. All that data. We don't need to talk about that, do we? We all know the data. Does everybody know all the data on all their students? Probably right now, many of us are still getting our new WIDA data and our TN Ready data. Okay, I'm going to skip that one too. All right, so the next thing, in order for us to give students an opportunity to choose the novels that they want to choose, we have to create conditions for language learning, okay? So what does that mean? Joseph gave us some really good examples. I really kind of like how his plenary kind of blended into my presentation. It was really kind of cool, okay? So anyone else? What are some things that are going to go into creating conditions for language learning? We're all tired. It's Friday afternoon, right? What do you do? So we're all kind of sitting in pairs. Most of us can probably talk in pairs or thirds. So talk to someone that is sitting next to you, because in my own classroom I probably would divide y'all up into different ways, but we're not going to do that right now. What are some things that you do in your classroom that creates conditions for language learning? Talk to your partner, neighbors, people in front of you, behind you. This is not the ideal room for something I would like to present in. So would anyone, let's see, over here, someone over here, give me something you do, Lori, to create, you knew knew I was going to pick on you. I have to know your name in order to pick on you. So Lori, what is something you do that creates a condition for language learning that can allow your students to have choice in what they're learning or reading? It's a little different than the question I asked before.
That last part was not on it. But,
no.
Because we mostly were talking about how we create an environment where it's okay to mess up, and it's okay to, we were talking more like it's okay.
It's okay to mess up?
Yeah, for them to make mistakes. And
it's okay for them to, does that help them learn to make choices?
no. I mean, maybe.
Does it? If you create a learning environment where a student can make mistakes, does that help them learn to make choices?
Yes.
Yeah. Does it help them learn the consequences of the bad choices? But yeah, it helps them learn to make choices. It helps them know that they can make a choice, that there are choices out there. But yeah, that's a good point. All right, in the middle here, Kelly. If I know your name, I'm going to pick on you. Whitney, I'm coming to you next. All right, Kelly, what is something that you do that helps or create a condition for language learning that could potentially allow them to learn to make choices?
I do flexible seating in my classroom. So they are responsible for choosing their own seat, but they have to choose a seat, they have to choose a smart seat where they can learn and not be distracted.
Very good. All right, Whitney. I haven't seen you in years, but I'm going to pick on you now.
Me personally, just the different ways I allow them to interact with their peers, or different ways I allow them to answer questions or show or say in a different way.
So different ways that she allows them to interact with their peers, different ways that she allows them to show what they know. Is that what you said? So those are different ways to talk about choice and what we could do in our own learning environment. And my things here, for me, where I think that students can learn to make choices is the first thing that I do is I create that high level of expectation. They're going to, how many of you have taught and given children the right to choose books, and they're going to choose that easiest book that they can find? Okay? So in order for them to make the choices that we want them to make in literature, we have to set that high grade level expectation. And we know that a newcomer, grade level expectation may be topic, not necessarily reading level. So if we know that they're going to study weather in 4th grade, I think that's what Joseph had up there, then we might have a lot of books that our 4th graders can choose on weather. And they be picture books with limited vocabulary or limited words, but they're going to be something that's related to that grade level expectation. Because we want to raise their learning, we don't want them to lower their learning. And for older students especially, they are either going to pretend they don't read, all right? We know they're going to sit back and they're going to pick that novel that's either really too hard for them to read and pretend to sit there and read it, or they're going to do something where they're going to try and get out of that reading because they don't want to be challenged or they're too embarrassed. One of the things that we really want to do is we want to avoid that learned helplessness. I taught middle school for 18 years. And oftentimes I would get those intermediate kids that never got past intermediacy because they were waiting for the teacher to be the one to make the choice for them, right? I don't know what to do. I'm too afraid to try. I'm too afraid to be challenged. And when we get to talk about student voice and student choice, it could potentially be because everything that they've ever been taught, everything they've ever learned from, every person they've ever seen as an authority does not look like them at all. And so sometimes they don't realize that they have a value of who they are, so they learn that helplessness. I read a book called Culturally Responsive Teaching in the Brain, if anyone has ever read that book. It talks a lot. It's not just about English learners, it's about diverse cultural people in general. And one of the things that that book taught me was it is a learning partnership. We know that we have to create that relationship. If I want Stacy, who is a good friend of mine on Twitter, but if I want Stacy to engage with me and I want to kind of guide her in those choices that I think are going to challenge her, I've got to know her, not just know her as a learner, but know her as a person, and she's got to think that I care about her. Okay? So and Culturally Responsive Teaching in the Brain is one of our ELL Chat Book Club books. But yeah. And I'm really not as proficient in this as I would like, but there's oftentimes a stereotype threat. Children of color, in general, there's those stereotypes out there. There's some really awful negative stereotypes right now about immigrants going around. If we think our children aren't seeing that and are not internalizing that, we're wrong. Okay? They do internalize that. They do hear what other adults are saying. And when they internalize those things, then there are a couple of things that happen. They become anxious about who they are. They don't want to speak their language, even though they don't speak English. They don't want to speak their own language, or they don't even want to try to speak English. And it becomes that fight, and I can't even say this word, so I apologize because somebody's going to, amygdala, it's going to kind of hijack that amygdala where they're always kind of in that fight mode, and so they don't know how to relax. And so only through developing relationships with them can we create a learning environment where they can make a choice, and then they're going to see their own past failures, the failures of what's being portrayed, because it tends to me that no matter what cultural you are, even if you're a native person to the United States, there's only the negative stuff that they see. That's what we see portrayed all the time. It's not the positive things. And so they just get this negative thing, and they feel like if they try, they're simply going to confirm that negative belief about themselves. And that's really convoluted and really deep, and I apologize if I didn't do it justice, but we have to help them change their internal voice so that they can make the right choices, and we can do that through literature, okay? Next thing we're going to talk about is design high-quality lessons for language development. And the next two are where I really are going to get into the meat, hopefully, of this. The first thing that we have to do to create high-quality lessons, this is not necessarily a literature or a choice things, is we have to have really good content objectives, and if you're in Rutherford County, that tends to look like a success criteria, a learning intention, and then we have to really do a really good language objective. They have to know what their target is. If their target is to be able to read at grade level, and it doesn't have to be that daily lesson, but they have to know the purpose. Why am I asking them to choose to read a book? Why do I care if they spend their time reading? Well, I care because I really want them to improve as a reader. Why do I want them to improve as a reader? Well, I want them to do well on the TN Ready test. Well, no. Yes, we do. Yes, we want them to improve their language scores, but we want them to improve as readers so that they can make intelligent decisions on their own, and they aren't waiting for somebody to make that decision for them, okay? This is an example that I took. This is our learning intention and success criteria from the beginning of our lesson. It's got to be measurable. If I'm going to ask them to read a novel, what is my objective for them reading a novel? More often than not, it's to discuss it, right? How many of us discuss those novels, those readings? What's the other purpose of them reading a novel? To write about it, right? So they need to know that yet we want them to free read, we want them to read. I'm all for free voluntary reading, but usually there's some sort of purpose to that. And here's my thing, I read a lot. I don't usually keep that to myself. I read for pleasure all the time. But I'm going to stand here in a few minutes and tell you about all the books that I've read for pleasure recently, because I get excited when I share about books that I love. And so we want our students to feel like they can talk about that and share those books that they really like, or go, my least favorite book I ever read was Lord Jim by Joseph Conrad. I didn't like that book. That's not an untruth. That's the truth. Anybody ever read anything by Joseph Conrad? Not one of my favorite authors. Okay. One of the ways to help students gain choice, gain literacy skills, is to create those theme-based units. And Joseph said it beautifully in there. The cells to life cycles to something else. The human body systems. He wanted it to connect, because the more that what we do connects, the better off it is. Well, one of the things that I love to do is those nonfiction pieces and those fiction pieces connect, right? I love teaching 8th grade because I love American history. I was a political science major in undergraduate school, and I love American history, so I could pull those texts that we could use to teach all those skills and then have them read some sort of fiction piece that accompanies that, all right? So I taught the same students 3 years in a row, because in ESL we tend to loop with our children whether we want to or not. This was a time when there were so many 6th graders, I had to teach 6th grade. 6th grade's not my favorite thing. Then I looped up into 7th grade that next year, and then for some reason I went up into 8th grade the following year. So I got the same kids. So I had to read different novels each year. Favorite novel I think I read in those 3 years that I pulled new was Dragon Wings. Has anyone ever read Dragon Wings by Lawrence Yep? It's an older novel, okay? It's a Chinese novel. Most of the students I've taught have been Hispanic. But we have a large population in Smyrna called the Korean. There aren't a lot of novels that are middle school appropriate that are for Korean students. So I was like, I need to pick something where they even look like the kids. Well, Dragon Wings by Lawrence Yep, I do have a copy of it somewhere up here. It's about the Chinese immigration. And my Korean kids read ahead because they wanted to read this novel. And they were excited to read this novel. Well, guess what? It's an immigration story. So every other immigrant kid in that class wanted to read this novel. Now, this was not the choice they made. This was the choice I made, right? Okay? But by giving them an opportunity to see themselves in a novel, allowed them to know that they could be successful even if the novel was above kind of where they were at a reading level. All right? So when we create our theme-based units, we're doing it to improve reading skills. We're doing it so that they can see themselves, so that they can in turn make those kinds of choices and feel success. All right? And then something else, when you're doing those nonfiction texts, know the books that you know that could relate to that, where you could allow them to choose. All right? So how many of you, most of you go to schools that have small class sets and libraries. People should not be spending tons of their own money on books, but if you're a librarian, your librarian may be able to be willing to buy you small class sets, or, you know, if that your librarian can go and pick, you say, what are the fiction texts that are related around, we're studying Civil War, pick me some fiction texts and then share them with your students and allow them to find those that might relate to them. That's a way to do that. And when we read the fiction text and the nonfiction text, it helps us build background. One of the greatest challenges our English learners have on state testing is they don't always have the background. It's not even that they can't even read the text, they just don't have the background to understand that text. And I have an example of that from years ago. I was tutoring a student, an African-American young man. We were reading a piece about soccer because I was told, it was when I was in college, I was told what I had to read with him. He didn't know what soccer was, so he kept pulling in his basketball, and he got very confused because at that point in time, soccer was not as popular as it is now. The women had not won the World Cup twice. Woo, woo! Okay, anyway, sorry. It wasn't as prevalent as it is now, and he didn't have that background knowledge. But I didn't know as a young student in school myself how to explain that difference to him. So that was an interesting thing for me. So scaffold the language, and this is just a very complicated slide. I'm not going to go through all of it. But when we're doing student choice, we can have different novels on their different reading levels that still maintain that grade level standard because it is on a grade level topic, right? So when we are scaffolding, we can, there's so much on this slide that I'm not going to talk about. I give a whole 2-hour presentation on scaffolding too, if anybody ever wants me to. Where this comes in is the materials and resources. When we give those resources of those choices to them through a classroom library, that's where we're scaffolding. Now's my favorite part, reading aloud. When we read Dragon Wings, I found some library somewhere in the United States had posted the audio of that book read by B.J. Chang or something. He was on law. He's a Chinese guy that was on Law and Order for a long time as the psychologist or something. If you all know, ever watched Law and Order, famous actor. He was reading the novel. His voice fit the character, right? Because you don't want some old white guy reading a novel where it's a Chinese character. And we read it aloud together as a class, and sometimes they read it to themselves because you do need to model that. But reading aloud for our English learners, even if they're reading their choice book and we know that that's a choice book that may be above their head, if we can find some audio of it anywhere, and let me tell you something, if you Google a novel, oftentimes you're going to find some free audio that probably shouldn't be free, that some school library or some public library has posted for public access, not intentionally breaking copyright laws, but let's face it, if it's on there, I'm going to take advantage of it, right? Okay? And then there's some great apps, and I don't know what they are off the top of my head, where you can find free audios. Our students, even if it's the choice novel they're making, they need to hear that language sometimes. They need to hear the enunciation, the pronunciation, the prodicee of that novel. Because we don't want them to have the wrong dialogue in their head of how English should sound. And sometimes they don't read aloud as well as we would like them to, and we don't want them to get stuck on that, right? And how many of you have ever sat through a class where a child is reading out loud because somebody told us that they should be reading out loud, and it's the most painful thing you've ever heard, and you're struggling, Deborah's struggling to read, I'm making her read in front of you, the rest of you have a copy of the novel, and you're either just as confused as Deborah and you have no idea what it's being said, or you're reading ahead or in middle school, you're snickering because poor Deborah is struggling, right? So I'm not saying the students should be reading aloud, unless sometimes you have really good proficient students that love to read aloud. My son, from the second grade on, could read a book aloud, and he didn't always know what it said, but he was really good at that. And so, he enjoyed that. We don't want to do that to children unless they want to do that. So my suggestion is find them free. If they're reading a novel that's above where they are, then we want them to listen to it so they can gain that knowledge. My favorite topic of all time. Strategies for student voice in reading and writing. My favorite book when I was growing up, and I still have the collection on the shelf in my office, is Trixie Belton. Anybody ever read Trixie Belton? Anybody ever read Nancy Drew? Hardy Boys? Okay. Let's see, what are some other ones that have been more recent? Maybe Encyclopedia Brown, those series books, okay? Trixie Belton, Nancy Drew, Hardy Boys, I loved them, but they were all white, middle-class characters. I identified with Trixie Belton. She was not rich, she was not poor. Her parents never had a lot of money, my parents never had a lot of money, but we weren't poor, right? I loved reading her books. I believe in series books for children, don't get me wrong. I think they're amazing. You don't ever have to figure out who the new characters are. You know the new characters, and and you know that it's very formulaic. Now, as of 2 months ago, I found out that the lady that wrote that book is a non-existent human being that was just a name, and that this guy created this formula, and he would send them out to different authors, and they would just write them. And then they would send them back, and they produced them under that author. That was done for Nancy Drew, Hardy Boys, Bobbsey Twins. Basically, there's a bunch of ghostwriters that use some fake person's name. That's a totally off the subject thing, but it broke my heart. Let me tell you something. Okay, so first of all, I wouldn't pull out Trixie Belton because there's no cell phones and TVs and stuff. And my students might not identify with Trixie Belton the way I did, but my students, I have read Esperanza Rising and The Circuit almost every year with any group of students I've taught, and I've never had a student tell me, regardless of their cultural background, that they didn't love those two novels. Esperanza Rising is probably my go-to novel for my advanced kids, and The Circuit has probably for my intermediates and my low intermediates. It's not good for beginners. But those are my favorite two novels. Why? Because my students see themselves in the story. If anybody in here knows Michael Shoulders, the author, does anybody in here know who that is? He wrote The T is for Tennessee. Okay, so here's a little side story. Michael Shoulders was a teacher at my elementary school as a child, and he directed me in a play. Okay, so Michael Shoulders, much later in life, was going around speaking, because he's a really good author, about authors. And I was teaching, and I was teaching ESL. He knows Pam Munoz Ryan, and we were talking about that, and I said, oh, I love to teach Esperanza Rising. And he goes, why would you teach that book? The themes in that book are so hard. I was like, because my students live those themes every day, right? I picked it because that theme was something my students could identify with. And because of that, that book has some amazing vocabulary in it. My students were willing to do that, what needed to be done in order to understand that book, because they could identify with that character. Their struggle, their poverty, they were rich, they became poor. Has anybody read that novel? If you haven't read that novel, I highly recommend you put it on your list. Why did I choose that novel? A, because I love the theme, and B, because my library had multiple copies of it, because it used to be on a 6th grade reading list sometime. You know, I didn't have the money to go out and buy it. The Circuit was recommended to me. If you have never read the 3rd chapter, which is just amazing, I had an Arabic student. The first year I ever picked that book, I also read the Harry Potter, which did not go over well with my English learners. But I picked The Circuit, and this young Arabic man came up to me and said, I never knew there were other people who felt the way I felt. Because Francisco, and this is based on a true story, he's a real guy in real life. He talks about how he would sit in class and he would stare at his teacher and pretend to be listening, but really his mind was off. And he talked about how he would get a headache from listening to English so much when he didn't understand it. How many of you teach elementary and you get the little kids and they come to you at some point in time during the day and their eyes are swollen and they look like they have a headache, especially those newcomers, because they have no idea what's going on all day long until they get to you? Or they come to you and they start crying, not because they don't want to be in your class, but because they're excited to be in their class, because they know they can be who they are. That book gives our students insight into that. So when my Arabic student, who also told me, Mrs. Tennyson, I hated all Americans until I met you. This was early in my teaching career. So those are books that I go to. There's Dragon Wings up here. So are you going to use the same book year after year? Are you, if you're going to teach a whole class novel or get your students, you're not going to, because every student you have every year are not the same, right? I'm not going to play these videos, but if you all know who how many of you know who Trevor Noah is? All right, how many of you know that he wrote a biography? How many of you like Trevor Noah? I highly recommend you do his biography on audio, but don't do it for students unless you want them to hear the F word come out of his mouth. If you know him, you know his language. And I don't mean the fact that he speaks all those different languages. I mean his American adoption of our sometimes vulgar vernacular, right? But he talks about storytelling and why we hook on to the things that we see, We don't care. A lot of us don't identify with some of the bad stuff that is going on in our country sometimes because we don't see ourselves in those stories, you know? And that's a shame, but it's the truth. So he talks about the power of storytelling. Jared Amato from Maplewood High School, if anybody follows me on Twitter, you know I love Project Lit Community. Project Lit Community, how many of you all know what that is? Have heard of that? If you don't, you need to look it up on Twitter. If you're not on Twitter, you can look it up without being on Twitter. Just Google Jared Amato. But he talks about book deserts and how there were, not only did students not have access to books, they didn't have access to books about people that they could see. He teaches at Maplewood High School, which is a high African American population, and he is a middle-class white guy. Well, guess what? He educated himself, he loves his students, and he took himself out of who he was and put himself in the shoes of his students, and as a result, he has a national movement, and he has himself won several awards. You don't have to be the same culture of your student in order to change your perspective on them, all right? How many of you all in here speak Spanish? How many of you all in here are of Spanish heritage? So most of the rest of us are not of that heritage, and those are the majority of the children in our classroom. Well, that doesn't mean we can't reach them. We just have to change sometimes our own choices that we're making. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the books that I've learned through ELL Chat Book Club and Project Lit. Thank you for reading my mind. Okay, so if you teach high school, don't ask Nona permission. But this is a great book to read with high school students. And the reason it does have high school themes in it. You would never want to read this with middle school unless you wanted to talk about some extracurricular activities that young people do that they shouldn't do at a young age. Does that make sense to everybody? I could use the word sex, but you know, anyway. So this is definitely geared toward high school, in my opinion, okay? It is a really great story about finding identity. Her parents don't speak English. We read this first through ELL Chat Book Club, and then that's how I actually found Project Lit, because they were reading it as well. This is also a great book. The girl is from the Dominican Republic. This is a great book for children who want to pick up because it's written in verse, and a lot of times it's less threatening to a student when they can read something in verse. Has anybody in here read Project X? Kelly's my home girl. Yeah, she's read it. Okay, so those are a couple of books that helped me discover how wonderful the Project Lit community was. These were last year's books. If you teach middle school, or if you have available funds to buy some novels, I'm looking over here in the corner. Front Desk is a really great, really sweet story about a Chinese immigrant story and about how she and her parents have to work so hard and then some of the ways that they take advantage of immigrants. It would be a great middle school novel, okay? This was on the Project Lit, and I think that this is one of the ones that Smyrna Middle is going to read next year as part of their Project Lit book club. Megan and I have discussed this book. Yes, ma'am.
Most of the Project Lit books have audio versions available on at the libraries. So there are several apps: Overdrive, Libby, Hoopla. I have about 5 different library apps, and you can check out those books for free and listen to the audio, and they all slow down. So if you could do a library, do one of these apps on a device in your classroom for the kids who are reading it you can actually slow it down where it goes a little bit slower. They can listen to it while they read.
So what she's saying is there's several library apps. You can get a lot of these for free, and you can slow it down so it's not so, because we do know rate of speech is something that our ELs sometimes struggle with, and it will slow them down. Or if you're like Kelly, who personally listens to them at double speed, or she speeds them up so that she can read them quicker, you know? If you're in the car, if you have a commute, that's one of the best things to do is to listen to audiobooks in the car. That's how I listened to Trevor Noah's book. I almost probably got in an accident once or twice just because he's so funny. So those are just some. There's some others up here, and I'm going to talk about them in a minute. So you've read. You have a classroom library. You yourself, if you don't know the books, you've read up on books, so that you can give students choice, so that they can see themselves. If you have a large Asian population and a Chinese population, they may choose this book to read because they see themselves, right? If you're in middle school, Mercy Suarez, this is a Puerto Rican girl. There are a lot of Puerto Ricans coming into Rutherford County. I don't know about, but this is about a Puerto Rican girl, and it talks a lot about her culture and what she can do to maintain her culture and how it can sometimes affect her in school. So this would be, but you need to know yourself, and that's why I love about Project Lit is I personally have read more in the last 2 years since discovering them for youth literature than I had in several years. Somebody said they were getting a master's degree. Who said they were getting a master's degree? When I got my doctorate, it took me a year before I could actually sit down and read for pleasure. So I totally get what you're getting at. So yeah, but the only way for you to help your students choose the right book as a learner is if we've got to be willing to find books outside the canon and willing to fight sometimes for their need to have them, okay? If you want some good fodder for your argument, go to Jared Amato's. He's got a really great blog, and he makes some really good arguments and can share with you some ideas. My next favorite thing to do, giving them voice in their writing. We know the ultimate goal is, can they read a piece of literature, cite that literature, and then write some sort of academic response. But we've got to get them there, and one of the ways to get them there is to create a way for them to write about themselves in response to literature. So a book that I used to read a lot, but I don't usually read anymore or had quit reading the last few years, is The 7 Wonders of Sassafras Springs. I liked that novel. The first few times I read it with the group of students that I had, they identified with it. We would then do a book about the 7 wonders of, it was Oakland Middle. I did the 7 wonders of Central Middle. That was back in the days when I taught there. I did the 7 wonders of Rockvale Middle because I read that when I was teaching at those schools. So the students it's the 7 wonders of the world. Your nonfiction text is to read about that. That is part of the 6th, 7th grade text now. I don't know where ancient, probably 6th grade is ancient, probably somewhere in high school. Read your nonfiction text so that they understand what 7 wonders are. This boy goes around and finds these really weird, exotic things about where he lives so that he can understand and appreciate where he lives before he goes away. We want our children to understand and appreciate where they are. And so I used to be a big camera person, and we would take pictures around the school, and they wrote their own story of their favorite things about the school, and it was almost always an end of the year project. I did this when I had 20 to 25 students. Once we got into a larger population, it was far too complex. When I Was Young in the Mountains, that's actually a picture book. Has anybody read anything by Cynthia Reliant? I love When I Was Young in the Mountains. So in order for you to learn about them, they could write it when I was a student in Mexico, when I was a student in Puerto Rico. So that's a great way for you it's a really quick read. You could do it in a week. You could have them write a few verses. For your more advanced students, you could have them pick out the pattern. For your beginners, you would obviously give them sort of the pattern, and they could fill in their information. All right? But that's where you're connecting their writing to literature. You're giving them voice into what they're writing about, what they're writing about in connection to what you want them to read about. I haven't done this because I took a new job this year as a coach and I'm no longer in the classroom, but one of my favorite books that I read, it's not a Project Lit book, but I found it because of Project Lit, I don't know, is Brown Girl Dreaming. It's this amazing, it's a verse book, and it's a bunch of little short verses, and you learn all about Jacqueline Woodson. This is a true story. She's won many honors for this. You learn all about her. This is the book that I would probably use as a model in middle school now. It's a great book. If you have not read this, I highly recommend it. And I could identify with her. She grew up in the 60s, but there were still many things that were happening in the 70s that hadn't changed that much. She was a child of poverty. My parents were middle class, but my parents never had any money. They were both just well educated. My father was a minister, my mother was a nurse. You know, we never had and nurses in the days, my mom made minimum wage most years. So we didn't have a lot of money. So there's things in here that I could really identify, and I think that's why I love this book so much. Plus, if you have children of color, there are many children of color sitting in our ESL classrooms who are not that are from Africa or from places where, but they could really identify with this book. This book was amazing. I highly recommend it. You don't win 3 awards and it not be a really, really good book, right? It's a National Book Award winner, it's a Newbery, and it's a Coretta Scott King. Highly recommend this one. And then the other one I have up there is The Poet X that I already talked about. Again, this is more of a high school book. Have them read it, have them pick apart, find something that they would want to model writing. This allows them to see themselves in the literature and then to turn around and make their own literature in writing. Now, you're saying, but I have to teach them how to write an essay, how to do this, how to do that. You do have to teach them how to do all that. But you have to show them that you value their voice and what they have and what they bring to the table so that it can create that. And I am going to run out of time. So, Green Card Voices is a way where immigrants have done stories, okay? You're going to adapt your lesson plans as needed. How many of you have to change plans in the moment? Because you think you know your kids, and then all of a sudden, right? You pick a book that you think they might like, they don't like it at all. So sometimes we have to make that adaptation, and guess what? Book abandonment is appropriate both as an educator and as a student. Juan de Pareja, which is a great book. I had read The Circuit. I thought, oh, here's a Mexican or Spanish character. I'll read this with my students. We got through the first chapter, and my students were like, Ms. Tennyson, we have no idea what's going on in this story. It's too hard for us to read. I abandoned that book. The few kids that I had, because I had a mixed ability class, a few of them kept reading it. Most of them said, I don't understand this. It's okay to abandon books, and I know that people may not agree with me on that, and you could just tell your students, well, I just teased you with this book, and if you want to continue reading it, you can. You don't have to tell them you're abandoning it, but in my mind, I'm like, I can't torture them and myself by continuing to read something that they don't connect with, that is just too difficult for them, that's not on a required reading list somewhere. And for some reason, I feel like I need to talk about wait time and signal response because I'm not doing a good job at it at all. So how many of you teach a mixed class where you're a grade level teacher and you're sitting in here and you're a grade level teacher? Okay, so you have that group of students. If we don't, our ELs take longer, right? And we know longer time can help them respond. We need some way for them to have that think time, but for everybody to know that they can sometimes go deeper. And those signal responses are so appropriate. If you understand what I mean, put 2 fingers on your chest. You know, that signal response. You can do that or not. But that's kind of an example of that. For some reason, I felt like I needed to point that out. And another way that they always get voices open-ended questioning, where they can tell you what they know and they're not looking for an answer and they don't know what any of those answers are. Well, what are the parts of the plant? Well, and they can tell you in Spanish, right? They know the parts of the plant. Well, then you can help them figure that out in English. Why do we give them choice? So that they can grow and we can eventually, hopefully, monitor and assess their student language development. So the 6 principles are very important. Student voice and student choice is very important. The ways that you create that in your classroom is, number 1, you read. Or, if you're like me, you go to Project Lit Community where everybody else has done the reading and you take that. There are some amazing English teachers out there that probably read a book a day. That's not me. So I'm just going to rely on them to do all that reading for me, and then I'm going to go through and look at those things and read the excerpts or listen to them on audio so that I can get through them quicker. All right, the second thing you need to do is you need to find a way to have those books available in your classroom, in your library, talk with your librarian, so that they can have that student voice in what they're choosing to read. All right, and that includes books in their native language. If in your school library there are no books in native languages that are available in your school, and in Rutherford County that's mostly Spanish, and that's Spanish and Arabic, and sometimes Japanese, hopefully you have some of those, because even if your student is not literate in their home language, if they see a book in Spanish on that shelf, that shows them that library values them as a human being, right? So, and values their culture. Because we have a lot of SLIFE kids that come in those upper grades that will never be able to read that Spanish version of Romeo and Juliet. But boy, oh boy, they'll check it out every time because they're so proud to have that book, right? So how do we know that they're reading? Well, if they're reading more and if they're discussing it with you, and then if they say to you, so I bought 2 copies of I'm Not Your Perfect Mexican Daughter. I don't know what happened to them. I had a couple of students that were 8th graders. It was toward the end of the 8th grade year. One of the girls goes, I shared that with my mom. I shared that with my whatever. There is a Spanish version of this book. So my book disappeared because those students shared it with each other. So sometimes when I buy books for my library, I know I'm not going to ever get them back, right? So my suggestion is find those books that you think your students want to read, know your students, teach around theme-based units where you're teaching the reading skills and you're allowing them some choice and they see themselves reflected in what you're teaching, okay? Sometimes you have a list that you have to choose from, but through that, perhaps you can find, how many of you are high school and you have to read Pride and Prejudice? Maybe nobody has to read that anymore? I had to read that. I actually like that book. She's a preacher's kid. I'm a preacher's kid, right? So there's a really great book by Isbana, I can't even say her name, called Pride. And it's set in Harlem or Brooklyn. I can't remember now. But it's set in New York. It's this African-American girl where they're gentrifying her neighborhood. But it's basically Pride and Prejudice set in Brooklyn. It's set in Brooklyn. Okay, and what her family does and goes through when those rich people buy that apartment complex and turn it into a one-family dwelling, and they're African American and the relationship that they have with them. It's a great book. I highly recommend that one too. One other book I want to recommend, and then I'm going to let y'all go. It's not a Project Lit book. I probably should do another one, but My Family Divided. I have a student who is now in high school whose father was deported in the middle of her 8th grade year. Okay? So her stepdad, who was really her dad. We can get into the legalities of documentation and undocumentation, but can you imagine what that did to her as a child? Okay? How many of you have watched Orange is the New Black? Did you all know that young lady, the Hispanic character on there, she grew up in the shadows because she's from Colombia and both of her parents were deported. And in high school, she lived in other people's homes, and she was an American citizen. She was born here, but nobody had any really legal right over her as a child. from about the time she was 15 on. This is her story. There's an adult version of this, and this is a youth version of this. This story, I recommend you read. You can tell the parts that I liked, because it helps you understand potentially what your children may have gone through if they had a parent that was deported. And then my next question is, do you know your learner well enough to even know if their parents, where their parents are? Do you know what I'm saying? How many kids in high school do we have that we know are potentially living on someone else's couch because their parents are not in the picture for whatever reason? And if you're like a really good friend of mine, you decide to take that burden on yourself and become that surrogate parent. That's not always a choice we can make, but we can support our students when they're in those situations. I would read this with middle school, but I would be very selective on who I might read it with. It's called My Family Divided by Diana Guerrero. Anybody, I don't watch Orange is the New Black, but it's one of my daughter's favorite shows. But this is her story. And it's a really good story, okay? So in the essence of time, you get 3 minutes. I probably have not done justice to this presentation the way I would have liked had I had a little bit longer time. But hopefully I've given you some ideas. Hopefully you can make a list of books that you could potentially go back and use. You're more than welcome to come up and look at the ones that I have up here that I didn't talk about. And then my next question is, does anybody have any questions? And does everybody want to go home because it's Friday afternoon?
Yes.
Yes, ma'am.
I have a specific student question. I have a ninth grader, or going to be a ninth grader, who speaks very well, an Arabic student. I just got him at the end of last year, and he is reading maybe on a third level. So do you have any suggestions as far as, I don't know that I could bring him any grade level reading.
So what are his oral language skills?
He speaks really well. He came at the end of last year, so I don't know him very well.
So he speaks English well, but he doesn't read very well. Or write very well. So my first suggestion is to get to know him, obviously, and what his interests may be, and find some audiobooks. And have him don't just listen to the book, but pair that book with the book and kind of, he's not going to necessarily follow along. I would pick a late elementary. I would pick it a couple of, because if he listens well, and then my other thing is he's going to need a lot of instruction in phonics, which is also a whole another thing. But you want to embed that in your classroom. You don't want to go through that kindergarten way of embedding phonics. So, but he's going to need some phonics instruction. If he has been in the country quite a long time, then you may want to potentially look at some Tier 2 or Tier 3 support in addition to what you're doing in ESL. Does anyone else have any questions? Specific? All right. So first of all, thank you. It's Friday afternoon, second day of the conference. I don't know if anyone would like to contact me. The best way to contact me is actually to follow me on Twitter and give me talk to me that way. At CB Tennyson. If you want to follow me on Twitter, if you're not on Twitter, get on Twitter. It's the best professional development you'll ever have. Yes?
Yes. Saved me. It's been the best year.
All right. Any more questions? Have a good afternoon. Enjoy your last couple of weeks of school. Get in the pool.